Good evening, everyone. I'm Louise Muir, President and CEO of the New York Historical Society, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you back to the History Hour, a live virtual program presented each Thursday evening exclusively for members and other supporters of the New York Historical Society. As always, I want to take a moment to thank all of our trustees, our Chairman's Council, and other supporters of our organization. It is you who make our work possible. I also want to encourage you to look out for an invitation to a special virtual public program that we will be presenting this coming Monday evening at 6 p.m. titled Leadership and Social Unrest. It will feature Harold Holzer in the moderator's chair, along with Jack Farrell and Randall Kennedy. And now to tonight's program. Valerie Paley, our moderator, is Senior Vice President and Chief Historian at New York Historical. She's also the director of our Center for Women's History. Harold Holzer is the author, co-author, or editor of more than 50 books on Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War era, including The Civil War in 50 Objects, which was also a New York historical exhibition back in 2013. Thank you both, Harold and Valerie, for joining us this evening. Tonight's program, which is being recorded, will last approximately 45 minutes, including 15 minutes for questions and answers, which you can submit via the Q&A function on your Zoom screen. We've disabled the chat function, so please make use of the Q&A. And now I am pleased to turn it over to Valerie and Harold.
Thank you, Louise. And good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to again have the opportunity to talk with my good friend and professional colleague, Harold Holzer. Before Harold and I get started, I want to remind you that, as Louise mentioned, you can ask questions anytime during the program by using the Q&A button at the bottom, or in my case, top of your screens. We'll get to your questions after our conversation. And now let's turn our attention to some objects that help us describe the Civil War. In the History Museum, objects do a lot of heavy lifting and standing in for larger historical narratives beyond the characteristics that define the object itself. So let's just talk for a moment about the book Civil War in 50 Objects, which inspired this program. Harold, tell us about it and how 50 objects can help tell the complex story of the Civil War.
It's extraordinary, really, because when we undertook this project 8 years ago, it was difficult to find just 50 objects, although we think they tell the story of the war. So it's a story of art, as you mentioned, artifacts, art, and objects standing in for the larger story. The story about race, the story about militarization, the story about dissent, soldier life, civilian life. But it's also a story about collecting and about the New York Historical Society as the trove of this city's lore from the Revolutionary period to today. And so I think it's a double story.
Absolutely. So let's start with our objects of the evening. Tonight, our topic is remarkably aligned with current events. The New York City draft riots during the Civil War have been considered the largest civil disturbance and the most racially charged in American history. And here are two objects that bore witness to this event, which took place over 4 days in July 1863. We have a wooden lottery wheel and a Bible. And if we can go to the image of our first object, the 19th century draft wheel. On July 10th, 1863, following the Union victories in Gettysburg and Vicksburg, the New York Times praised the immediate enforcement of a new draft. There were 300,000 new recruits were needed to shore up the Union Army and beat the now struggling Confederacy. So days later, the first names of draft eligible men were drawn from wheels just like this one. Harold, tell us about this object.
So it's an unusual looking object to modernize for sure, but think of it as a large hand cranked device look at the aperture with the cover with the lid at the top. So in this wheel were the names of conscripts. Now the draft is employed when recruitment does not equal state requirements. So by July, New York had to begin conscription. And it was the first military draft in American history. So it's not the most popular event in recruiting. This wheel was used at a draft office on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. It contained a number of names, and it would be cranked by a provost marshal in public. And then someone would open that lid, stick his arm in, and the first unlucky draftee's name would be called. Presumably, young men would be lined up outside, and they would go right from that office into the Union Army. So it was not a popular object, to be sure, and it was a time of tremendous anxiety.
Absolutely. And this object came into the collection of the New York Historical Society soon after the end of the war. You say in your book that within this object were an ethnic tapestry of names and occupations, and the object actually came with many little draft cards with names. If we could see the image of that, all handwritten, just like this.
So I think we assume that the draft riots that we'll be describing momentarily interrupted the calling of names. We don't know how many were removed and announced, but there were plenty of them in the wheel when it came to the Historical Society. And Val, as you'll remember, in our exhibition, we strung out the names in sort of like a clothesline fashion. It was a huge cluster of names. And here they are. You see William Kuhn, I'm just guessing, a German American, and Joseph Illwitzer, probably a Jewish shoemaker from First Avenue, a paper box maker from East 7th Street. So this is the neighborhood, willingly or unwillingly, about to see action in the Civil War.
Mm-hmm. So the Federal Conscription Act was passed by Congress in March of 1863. Explain to us what exactly it was and what its flaws were.
So it is, again, for want of re-recruits and re-enlistees, it's a way to swell the ranks of the Union Army. Think at the same time that African-American troops are being recruited in the border states and in New England, New York did not have a great record on that aspect. We didn't raise our first African-American regiment for another year and a half after this event. So the laws passed to add to the ranks through conscription. But yes, Val, it has a flaw, and as we'll see, kind of a fatal flaw. And that is that if you paid $300 for a substitute, but it's really an exemption from the draft, you could buy your way out of the draft. So that led to, before the actual draft begins, a huge amount of criticism in the Democratic press that this is a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. $300 was, otherwise all men 25 to 45 are eligible for conscription. And $300 was the average annual wage of a laborer in New York. So this is a big lift. And in the days leading up to the first names being pulled, while the Republican newspapers in New York, like the Times and the Tribune, are saying it's our patriotic duty to go through with the draft, the Democratic press, Copperhead press to some degree, is saying we will never fight an N-word war. We will not fight for African Americans. Remember, the Emancipation Proclamation is only 2 months old. And the Democratic press whips the opposition into a frenzy. And New York is a largely Democratic town. It voted more than 67% against Abraham Lincoln in 1860. We have a lot of Irish Americans in the city who are not only conscription, angry about the $300 exemption, but have been told by I guess, an early form of yellow journalism, that if they go to fight for the Union, that African Americans who are freed will come into New York City and compete with them for their jobs on the docks and in the factories by accepting lower wages, having never been paid any wages. So a great deal of racial hatred is being stirred up in this population as well. And it's a hot period, it's ugly, and that's the foundation of what occurred on July 13th.
And it is literally hot. It's the summer. And talk us through these first few days of the draft. What unfolds over the weekend and then
Yeah.
starting on Monday, the 13th?
Right. So it starts, it proceeds okay. And then the Sabbath, the Sunday, the 12th, there's a pause, according to New York culture and tradition. And then it resumes on a particularly hot day, Monday, July 13th. And New Yorkers can really visualize these streets because it begins around 2nd Avenue in the 40s, 46th, 47th Street, UN neighborhood. And just before the Provost Marshal's office reopens, someone throws a brick or a cobblestone through the window of the draft office and then sets the draft office on fire. And that is the opening round in the Defiance. The mob grows and grows, excuse me, and the protesters, as it were, begin to march downtown and disrupt the draft in other places. And then this demonstration it metastasizes all over Manhattan.
Yeah, I mean, you call them a race riot, and in fact, that is what it turned into. We have an image of some of the violence that occurred. Who were in these mobs, and who did the mobs target?
So the targeting, and this is going to sound eerily familiar, when anger boils over, irrational decisions sometimes are made. And Brooks Brothers, for example, was targeted and looted. Stores were targeted. The homes of abolitionists and leading Republicans were targeted. The mayor's house was attacked. Police officers were beaten up. Newspapers were attacked, Republican papers. But as you said, Val, the ugly truth is that it turned into a hideous race riot early on. An African-American child was beaten right near City Hall, Chambers Street, and Broadway. And then the mob, as it grew, as it intensified, began attacking prostitutes who were known to entertain Black men as clients, interracial couples who lived in the Lower West Side of Manhattan. And ultimately, African Americans were just dragged from carriages, chased down the street. Some were driven off the docks and just drowned. And in this infamous scene, one African American was lynched, set afire, and then dragged to the streets. It was hideous. There was sexual mutilation going on, open, blatant murder without punishment. And anytime the police did try to intervene to protect New Yorkers of color, the mob turned its wrath on the police as well.
We have another image, actually, of the police at the Tribune office. I believe that's next up on our. Yes. So
coming soon.
Describe some details from these 4 days, and by July 17th, what happens?
Well, it was also an anti-press riot, as I mentioned, and the two leading pro-Lincoln papers are sitting just south of City Hall Park. It's called Newspaper Row. And here you see a crowd being dispersed. So crowds menaced the New York Times and the New York Tribune. Both newspapers armed themselves. Henry Raymond, the founder of the Times, was on the roof of his building with his investor, Leonard Jerome. And if that name sounds familiar, he had a 9-year-old daughter named Jenny, who was destined to be the mother of Winston Churchill. But Leonard Jerome and Henry Raymond were on the roof of the Times with a Gatling gun, aiming it at protesters who were threatening the paper. It was a new building. The New York Tribune armed itself with munitions and grenades from the Brooklyn Navy Yard. And eventually this mob, and you see that some of the caricatures are, blatantly anti-Irish caricatures. Eventually they did crash through the downstairs rooms of the Tribune, which were reserved for buying subscriptions and papers and ads. And they set fire to this room. It was called the counting room. And then an army of New York police came out of the darkness down from City Hall Park south and attacked the mob and dispersed them. So the attempt to interfere with progressive newspapers was blatant also. And this is just one of the scenes that took place in July. And but as you point out, it ended only. By the way, it was a male and female riot. Women mostly dug cobblestones out of the pavements and then gave it to their men to hurl through the streets. And this went on down the Lower West Side. 59th Street, there was a lot of rioting across 59th Street. Central Park was being built then. So ultimately, Abraham Lincoln, who was totally silent on this, the governor was sort of friendly to the rioters. He called them my friends. But ultimately, Lincoln authorized the deployment of, and this is going to sound eerily familiar again, the deployment of federal troops who were dispatched from the Gettysburg area north on trains, and they ultimately fired their weapons downtown, and that ended the riot.
We have other images actually or one more image of fires that there were lots of burning buildings and other such riots and conflict.
And here's the army
Yes.
facing off against the rioters. I think the rioters here are a little better armed than they were in the city, but it gives you a sense of the chaos. There weren't many, so we'll never know the fatality rate. They say there were 120 deaths and 8,000 injuries. That's a lot in 1863, if you do it as a portion of population. But I don't believe the 120 figure. I don't think African Americans who were, pushed off the docks were counted, and people whose bodies were burned were counted. So I would say it was 10 times as high as we believe.
Sure. What happened to that $300 bounty provision in the aftermath of these riots, just as a kind of a coda?
So the bill was corrected. It is possible to correct legislation. Before it was corrected, the new Democratic mayor of New York City passed a bill in the city council to have New York City pay the $300 bounty to anyone who didn't want to serve, the $300 exemption fee. So the city ultimately bore the expense to protect protesters or anti-war Democrats. It was a mess. Ultimately.
But a lot of African Americans actually did sign up voluntarily, though, too.
Absolutely. Although African American New Yorkers had to find other places to volunteer because, again, New York didn't raise its first troops black troops until September '64.
So the detritus of these riots, the mess, the burned and the sacked stuff, all of that stuff was thrown into the rivers or thrown out, and it's really amazing that this draft wheel survived. And then the buildings might have been torn down, new structures took their place. But we want to really look deeper into the human toll of this this disturbance, the worst urban violence in memory. The second object of the evening really does speak to this in a very poignant and very emotional and almost tragic way. Can we see our second object? It is a rare book. And give us some background for this, please, Harold.
Um, and this is an emotional story, to be sure. This Bible is an original Bible that was used at the so-called Colored Orphan Asylum, um, an institution for African American orphans that was founded about 10 years before the Draft Riots and was considered a model for the care of children. It had playrooms, it had an area, it had gardens, it had sleeping quarters with very big windows to provide ventilation. It had good food, it had teachers, and it had a population of orphans who actually, one of them went on to fight in the fabled 54th Massachusetts Regiment that achieved glory from the movie of the same name at Fort Wagner at the same moment. July 1863 was Fort Wagner, when African Americans died in huge, disproportionate numbers defending the Union. So this Bible was used inside the asylum, and I won't yet give away the story of why it's charred, but
So the Orphan Asylum was founded by Quaker women from the New York Manumission Society in the 1830s, and then moved to this wonderful location in 1843. So
which we should
it's sort of
say was on Fifth Avenue and 43rd Street. It was the northwest corner, and the biggest landmark nearby was not the New York Public Library, but the big reservoir, the New York City water reservoir that stood then on the site of the library. So it was a wonderful part of town, and people would come and look at this model institution as a charitable good work of which many people were proud.
we have an image of some of the children playing in the garden there. It's a pretty famous image that's in the collection of New York Historical.
And this
So,
it's a great image, and it's probably the year before the Draft Riots.
yeah. So talk us through July 13th, 1863, and that was the initial afternoon of the rioting, and what happened at the asylum.
So on July 13th, a large mob of maybe 1,000 or more people massed outside of the orphan asylum. And if we can see the next slide, you'll see what happened. The building was breached. It was looted. Rioters carried off the beautiful beds and mattresses, not before they took enough straw out of the mattresses to use as kindling, because they set the building on fire. And here is an artist's rendering of this horrific scene. If you wonder where the African American children are, that is the agonizingly heartbreaking, horrific story. There were 233 children, and they were all trapped inside when this blaze began, with rioters outside taunting the teachers to bring the kids outside so they could be killed. And that's the moment
They
when
round up the children. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the moment when we don't know whether it was a teacher or a little girl. There are many legends about what happened next, but I like to think it was this one prescient, brave little girl who said, "Isn't that the Bible that you always told us to follow?" And then the teacher picked it up and said, with smoke in this room, said, "Children, follow me out. If you follow the good book as you always have." And they got outside, and again, they just filed outside very quietly, and these children heard unbearably horrible taunts as they made it outside. But there were a few people who sheltered these kids. Some of them just dispersed and were taken in by white families in their brownstones. A young Irish kid took some of them down to a police precinct. And we don't know that there were any casualties except the near miss, the near disaster, and the emotional scars that this day undoubtedly left on so many people.
just harrowing the imagery is. We have another image too, which looks a little bit more benign than this, but it shows the bucolic nature of this site. But in the foreground, obviously, some
of the artists made it
violence.
seem, yeah, I guess you have to imagine that those are not clouds over the trees; those are flames and smoke. But here, and it's not quite as vivid in sacking
dramatic.
and looting.
Yeah.
But clearly a huge news event and a great shame on the city. I should say that there were religious leaders who tried very hard to stop this from metastasizing the way it did. Protestants and Catholics, Protestant churches were targeted, leading African Americans. Henry Highland Garnett was a great Black liberator who lived in Manhattan. His daughter, when she heard the rumblings, went outside and pried his nameplate off of his door, which probably saved his life. Horace Greeley, the editor of the Tribune, walked out into the crowd, and his lookalike was beaten up instead. So, but this is the worst. This is absolutely the low point of New York history, I think.
Yeah. Yes. So, and a lot of the times we don't learn about it in history books, so it does bear repeating as a cautionary
and by the way,
tale.
And I think this is a serious problem for us in memory. As we've heard in the last few days, as we speak of more Confederate statues being earmarked for removal, there is no monument or plaque that attests to the draft riots.
That's right.
And the toll they took on the honor and the civility and the lives of New York and New Yorkers. And I think that we have to have a movement to remember even unpleasant parts of our history, because ultimately, if they didn't make us better right away, at least they struck appropriate shame into the hearts of progressive New Yorkers.
Absolutely. So just a couple more questions before we go to our Q&A portion. The children, 3 days later, were taken by boat, escorted by Zouave guards to an almshouse across the East River on Blackwell's Island, which is now Roosevelt Island.
Right.
And were all the children saved? It's not answered in the text, and I think it's hard to tell, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It's very hard to tell. We assume there were no casualties, but again, how can I say this? Black lives didn't matter in 1863,
Yeah.
even in New York.
Particularly
so
children.
I don't have any faith in the actuarial counts. We think that most of the children were rescued. At least, and nearly all, I should say.
So one important thing was in fact saved, and it was this Bible.
Yeah.
So we have the inscription blown up, so you can see the inside of that object, and there's something so almost chilling and immediate about seeing the charred edges and this inscription on the inside.
Yeah, it is said this Bible was in the asylum before the destruction of the asylum on Fifth Avenue by the rioters. And this, it is charred around the edges, which is, like Value said at the beginning, objects can testify historically and emotionally to events. I don't think there's a more powerful relic in the collection than this. And the entire records, all the records of the Colored Orphan Asylum went to the New York Historical Society, which, I got to read so many of the minutes of the meetings before and after the riots.
Yeah, one can almost imagine the child holding this Bible and just what this object bore witness to. I find it can send chills up your spine and down your spine to imagine that.
There are moments when you can hold up the Bible and it will do some good, right? It's not just a photo opportunity. I hate to say that and trivialize it, but just think of a child holding this Bible as a beacon for people to go through smoke and flame to escape into another, mob. it's unimaginable. We should take a peek with a site today.
Yes.
If we can look at the next slide, because I'm sure there are members of the Century Club on our call and on our Zoom today. That red brick wall in the background of this photo is the Century Club. And this is a vacant lot. The owner has gone bust trying to build a gigantic office tower here. So it's still a vacant lot. Here again, I'd love to see a plaque one day attesting to this event. By the way, the orphan asylum never rebuilt here. It decided that Midtown Manhattan was not safe for an African-American institution. So they moved progressively uptown, eventually to Harlem. They became a foster care agency. Then they moved to Riverdale. And the Colored Orphan Asylum building in Riverdale ultimately became the Hebrew Home for the Aged. So it's just a multi-generational transformation, but always devoted to care, interestingly.
Interestingly. So we're ready right now for our Q&A. And the first question is, was paying your way out of the draft done in the Revolutionary War as well? Was the Civil War the last time that was acceptable?
So there was no conscription in the Revolutionary War. The draft was introduced by Abraham Lincoln. You know, take the bad with the good. He introduced us to the military draft and to federal income taxes. So this was the first time. And again, the rich man's exemption was a big mistake, and it was never employed again.
Actually, just almost as a follow-up to that, the next question is, did the wealthy people flee the city during the riots?
Well, there wasn't as much mobility as there is now. And Val, when we did the Lincoln in New York exhibition, we came across accounts of wealthy people who were, you know, terrorized and hid in their attics. And most of the rioters who went after private homes were interested in property. And we found a great story of people finding engraved portraits of Abraham Lincoln in someone's home and throwing them out the window, and then seeing them trampled in the streets. So I don't think people had the mobility that they do today. Yeah. Horace Greeley, on the other hand, was one who did. He got out of town and went to his country home in Chappaqua.
Interesting. Yes. So why were Black men not eligible for conscription?
So Black men were eligible for conscription and enlistment. The New York culture was not yet ready to organize Black regiments. So you don't just join the Union Army. You have to sign up with a regiment. And New York's early Civil War tradition was ethnic regiments. The Irish Brigade, Fighting 69th, German-American regiments, the 7th Regiment. We know where the Armory is today. It was in Union Square in those days. Now it's on 68th and Park. But that was the elite regiment of wealthy people. So you had to attach yourself to a regiment. And not until the Union League Club organized an African-American regiment in '64. By the way, they had to be trained on, I think, Governor's Island, because people were so petrified of the idea of African-Americans arming themselves in what was essentially a white-dominated town. So African-Americans are eligible to serve in the Union forces, officially bearing arms, at around the same time, March 1863, when Congress legislates the desire of the expressed in the Emancipation Proclamation to open the services to African Americans.
Next question. Is it not true that New York State contributed more soldiers and suffered more casualties than any other state during the Civil War, North or South?
Yes. 10% of the casualties or so of the Union casualties came from New York State. Enormous, and also material investment. New York, for a time, escaped the destruction that the South was visited upon because of initiating the war. But the New York Draft Riots certainly reminded people that the war could come to backyards in northern cities. And New York's draft riot, I always add, was certainly the worst, as you said in the beginning, Val, the worst civil disturbance in the history of America, save for the Civil War itself. But there were draft riots in Connecticut, there were draft riots in the Midwest. No one wanted to be drafted, especially with that rich man's exemption there. So ours just got out of hand most violently and most horrendously.
Yeah, and it was reported too by the
You know,
press.
if you're going to do a riot, don't do it where all of the artists and photographers are headquartered. They're going to be
Exactly.
recorded for all time in infamy, for sure.
And the media. And this is sort of, in a way, related. A question about the Irish. Did the treatment of the Irish by the English contribute to the Irish rage? I mean, let's talk a little bit about Irish rage in the draft riots.
Well, not pretending to be an expert, but yes, these are survivors of the famines and the oppression of the English in starving people in Ireland. Many had come to New York and the New World seeking opportunity. They were treated badly. They were treated as second-class citizens. The Democratic Party, very cleverly from the 1840s on, pushed them to register in the Democratic Party. And as a result, many elites demonized the entire Democratic Party as a party for ruffians. And all of the canards and cliches about the Irish, about drinking, about hooliganism were created during this period. But was it a largely Irish-American riot? One would have to say it was, although one of the battlers to stop it. But it was a largely Irish-American population that was being subjected to this unfair draft. The racism, of course, inexcusable. And people who were experienced prejudice should not have visited prejudice on others, but it happens, I think, culturally all too often.
Absolutely. Next question. Were they able to raise the 300,000 soldiers that were needed?
Yes, they were able to raise the troops, and then they raised another 400,000 the following year. So the draft worked. Again, there was also recruitment. It was a ceiling of soldiers that was needed, and the quotas were filled by a combination of volunteering and there was a war spirit, especially after the proclamation, to put down the rebellion, to end slavery, and New Yorkers contributed to that fight, as did Irish American brigades. The Irish American troops fought at Gettysburg heroically. So, we're talking, we don't want to tarnish an entire group here because the courage was manifest across all ethnic lines during the Civil War.
Absolutely. I think that the current climate in New York and in this country is on people's minds. And one question that has emerged is, how did the mayor and the governor of the state respond then? And does that shed any light on how they should respond now?
Well, the mayor was attacked pretty early, Mayor Opdyke. Governor Tilden was a Democrat, and he was opposed to the draft and had spoken out pretty viciously against the draft. I mean, it's political. He can say what he wants, obviously. But during the outbreak of the riots, he, to his credit, I suppose, as an act of bravery, he came into the middle of one of the demonstrations and tried to quell the riot. But he did it with an unfortunate peroration that came back to haunt him. He started by saying, "My friends," and after that, all of the Republican press around the country branded him as an appeaser, as a rioter, because, that "my friends" phrase followed him all the way to his presidential candidacy 13 years later when, well, he won the popular vote, but was kind of robbed of the electoral vote in Florida, talking about history.
Interesting, repeating
Cycling
itself.
back, Florida was the decide, and the Supreme Court decided it. So Tilden was on, both of them were on the scene. So they were very much in the thick of things, both the mayor and the governor. And they did not see eye to eye, which is another New York tradition, I suppose.
Apparently so. Um, Question, are there any photographs of the riots? And if so, are they in New York Historical's collections?
So, Val, I don't know about you, but I've never seen a photograph. And here's the thing we have to keep in mind. Civil War photography was a booming industry. It's the first war to be recorded by the cameras, but I've only seen one or two battle photographs of the entire Civil War. It was when a battle was raging and bullets were flying and artillery was firing, it was not a good idea to put your head under a covering and peer into a glass lens. That was dangerous. So all of the photography we see are portraits and camp scenes and burial scenes, and no photographer went out into this craziness to try to take a picture. Although, you know, I've been proven wrong before. If anyone out there has ever seen one, let us know. The Historical Society needs that image for the collection.
Absolutely, but there is no combat photography in that period for obvious reasons. Did the Confederate government have anything to do with stirring up the rioters?
Abraham Lincoln said after the draft riots that we have two volcanoes to deal with. I don't think it was the Confederacy encouraged it. I mean, they were doing a draft as well. They were drafting younger people and older people. If you could walk reasonably well, you would be drafted in the Confederacy. So I don't, you know, there were those who opposed emancipation as a reason for the war, as a new rationale for the war, and they were violently opposed to a draft that was going to be used to fight for African-American freedom. By the way, I forgot to leave out one amazing detail about Abraham Lincoln, if I can rush it in. So
Sure.
A couple of days before the draft, well, a week before the draft riots, while the Battle of Gettysburg was raging, Mary Lincoln was in a carriage accident outside their summer home near Washington. She was thrown from the carriage when the wheel fell off. I believe it was an assassination attempt against Lincoln, but she hit her head on a rock and the wound became infected. And Abraham Lincoln was fighting, masterminding action and waiting for news from Vicksburg, and she was in serious trouble. So he wired his son at Harvard, come home, your mother has been in an accident, she needs you. And Robert Lincoln left Cambridge, came down to New York City, and when he got here, well, all this excitement was happening. So he just stayed and watched the draft riots.
Wow.
Lincoln wrote an agonized telegram because by now he knows that these disturbances are taking place. And he says, why do I not hear from you? And the answer is a 20-year-old young man, not quite 20, if he had to choose between an exciting event or taking care of his mother, he chose the exciting event. And he finally left when the riots were just about over.
Again, some things don't change, right?
I know.
Last question. Do we know from letters or diaries if any soldiers who were already serving in the army heard about the riots? And if they did, what did they think?
That's a terrific question. I wish I had a terrific answer. I haven't really seen any diary or letter references to the disturbances around the country. But, you know, the people in the field would, I think, have been horrified by what they would perceive as a lack of patriotism and willingness to join the battle to save the Union and to free the slaves. I wish we could have ended on a question where I had some real evidence, but.
Well, all right, so here's one more question.
Okay, good. I'll do a fast
this is one that
answer.
we anticipated. Was the depiction of the riots in the gangs of New York, the film, accurate?
Thank goodness you got to that one, because we did
exactly
predict that we would get it.
we
So
did predict that one.
The answer is no. It was wildly exaggerated, although I have to say a scene of Barnum's Museum opposite City Hall was attacked, but I don't think the elephants and the lions and tigers, I don't think there were that many animals, it's not the circus, were running across Midtown Manhattan, and there were no gunboats firing from shore. That's an exaggeration. The Union Navy did not order ships to fire on the city. That would have been totally crazy. So, you know, there was restraint. And by the way, I was a sort of a behind the scenes advisor to Gangs of New York, although I didn't have as much to do with it as I did with the Lincoln movie. So, but I thought in case anybody ever saw my name, that I'd do a mea culpa. Sorry about that.
We won't blame you, Harold.
Okay.
Well, I see we're about out of time, and I want to thank you, Harold Holzer, for being such a terrific partner, as always, in these programs.
Thank you.
And
Thank you, Val. And thanks to
it's
Louise
so
for
much
making
fun.
this happen too.
Absolutely. I mean, this is so enjoyable for us to revisit this wonderful book and these great objects. And I want to thank our audience also for watching this evening, for your attention, your questions, and your membership support. We look forward to seeing you back here a week from tonight, when we'll be looking at the topic of war and technology. So until then, thank you so much, and good night.
Good night.